Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
Think about a baby's first year. We marvel at how quickly they grow, hitting milestone after physical milestone. But did you know that the brain undergoes an equally incredible transformation in those early years, laying the groundwork for everything they'll learn and do?
It really is amazing. It's a period of intense development, almost as rapid as their physical growth spurt, like you said.
Yeah, exactly. And the big question is, how can we possibly understand and, track this complex brain development as it happens?
Well, that's precisely what makes a new study from the University of North Carolina so groundbreaking, I think. Today, we're taking a deep dive into their research, which used magnetic resonance imaging, that's a detailed brain scanning technique, to essentially map out how different brain regions connect and mature in children from birth all the way up to age 6.
Right. We've got a really helpful health news article summarizing this work, which is great, and also the original, much more detailed scientific paper published in Nature Human Behavior.
Yes, the original paper is quite dense but full of detail.
So our goal today is to unpack what this research reveals about, typical brain development during these crucial early years, and also to explore its potential for maybe helping us identify when a child's brain might be developing differently.
Exactly. We want to give you the essential insights without getting too bogged down in the really complicated scientific jargon.
Okay, so maybe let's start with the background. Why is this kind of study even needed? We track physical growth pretty well already.
Yeah, it's worth remembering that while we have these really well-established charts to monitor physical growth, height, weight, head circumference, things like that, we haven't had similar comprehensive tools to track the development of brain function.
Ah, okay. Function, not just size.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Early childhood is such a dynamic period for the brain. The connections between brain cells are forming and changing at just an astonishing rate, and this is the very foundation upon which all future cognitive abilities will be built.
Absolutely. And this study tackles that challenge head on. So the researchers used a specific type of magnetic resonance imaging called functional magnetic resonance imaging. Can you explain a bit about how that lets them study brain development, especially in such young kids?
Certainly. So functional magnetic resonance imaging works by measuring brain activity indirectly. It looks at changes in blood flow. The basic idea is that when a particular area of the brain is more active, it needs more oxygen, right?
Right.
And the scanner can detect these subtle changes in blood flow that indicate that increased activity. What's particularly ingenious about their approach here is that they scan the children while they were resting or even sleeping.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because you can't exactly ask a baby to do a task in there.
Not easily. As you can imagine, it's nearly impossible to ask a baby or a toddler to perform specific tasks inside a noisy magnetic resonance imaging scanner and stay still. So resting or sleep scans are key for this age group.
Right. It sounds like they needed a lot of data to create these kinds of brain growth charts.
They did indeed. The researchers compiled a really substantial data set. It was 1,091 functional magnetic resonance imaging scans from 501 participants.
Wow.
And these participants ranged in age from newborns right up to 6-year-olds. This impressive amount of data was gathered across 5 separate research projects, too.
Okay, 500 kids, over 1,000 scans. But collecting data from such a wide age range, newborns to 6, that must have presented some unique challenges, right? Like, I can imagine the brain activity of a sleeping infant would look quite different from that of an awake 5-year-old.
You've absolutely hit on a very important point. That was a big hurdle. To minimize movement, which can significantly distort the brain images, younger children are typically scanned while they're asleep.
Okay.
Older children, on the other hand, they're often scanned while awake, maybe watching a quiet video or something to help them stay still. And you're right, the patterns of brain activity are naturally different in these two states, sleep versus awake.
Okay, so how on earth did the researchers manage to compare brain activity across these different states and age groups? That sounds like a major headache.
It was a significant methodological challenge, for sure. To address this, they employed some pretty sophisticated statistical techniques. One was called elastic net regression.
Elastic net regression, okay.
Yeah, think of it like they had a vast collection of puzzle pieces, the brain scans, and this method helped them to predict how the pieces would fit together, even when some were from sleeping brains and others from awake brains. It sort of allowed them to estimate what brain connectivity would look like in one state, say awake, based on the data from the other state, like sleep and vice versa.
Wow.
And they also used another method called combat. Imagine that the data was collected using slightly different measuring tapes at the 5 different research sites.
Because different scanners, different protocols, maybe?
Exactly. So combat helped to calibrate these tapes, ensuring that the measurements were as consistent as possible across all the locations. It harmonizes the data.
Wow. Okay, that's quite a bit of complex analysis behind the scenes. So after all that processing, what exactly were they measuring in the brain? What aspect of function?
They were primarily interested in what's known as functional connectivity.
Functional connectivity.
Yeah, think of it as how different regions of the brain synchronize their activity. If 2 brain areas are communicating frequently, their activity patterns will tend to rise and fall together, you know?
Okay, like they're working in sync.
Precisely. To examine this, they first divided the entire brain into regions. They used a map, basically, with 100 cortical regions, that's the outer layer responsible for higher level thinking, and 10 subcortical regions, which are deeper structures involved in more basic functions.
Gotcha.
And then they focused specifically on 8 well-established groups of these regions, which are referred to as canonical brain networks. These are networks we already know quite a bit about.
Okay, and what are the main roles of these 8 brain networks, just briefly?
Sure. Each one plays a crucial role. There's the visual network, obviously processing what we see. The somatomotor network is involved in our movements and our sense of touch.
Okay.
The limbic network is key for emotions. The default mode network is often active when we're not focused on a specific external task, like when our minds are wandering or we're thinking about ourselves.
I heard of that one.
Yeah, it's a big one. Then we have the ventral and dorsal attention networks, which are involved in how we focus our attention on different things, both reacting to stimuli and directing focus.
Attention, okay.
The control network is essential for planning, decision-making, and our ability to regulate our thoughts and actions, sometimes called executive functions.
The brain CEO, sort of.
Kind of, yeah. And finally, the subcortical network, which includes those deeper brain structures, supports many basic functions, but also contributes to cognition.
Okay, so they create these growth charts showing how the connections within each of these 8 networks change from birth to age 6. What were some of the main developmental patterns they observed? What did the charts show?
Well, they uncovered some truly fascinating trends. For instance, the visual network showed a peak in its connectivity quite early in life, around 5 months old.
5 months? Wow, that's early.
Very early. After that peak, it appeared to become more specialized, meaning the overall connectivity within the network actually declined a bit before stabilizing at around 4 years of age.
Huh. So it gets stronger than sort of refines itself.
That's one interpretation, yeah. It suggests the brain might be particularly primed for visual learning in those first few months. Think about how rapidly a baby starts to recognize faces. This rapid connectivity could be the neurological foundation for that.
Makes sense. What about other networks?
The somatomotor network, involved in movement and touch, showed a different pattern. Its connectivity actually dropped from birth and then settled around 18 months.
Dropped. Why would it drop?
Well, it might reflect a process of pruning unnecessary connections or perhaps increased efficiency within the network, but it settles fairly early. The limbic network, involved in emotions, showed an increase in strength, reaching a peak around 10 months before leveling off.
10 months for the emotional network peak. That's really interesting, linking it to maybe when babies are developing stronger emotional responses or attachments.
It's certainly tempting to make those connections, yeah. And what about the networks involved in more complex cognitive functions?
Yeah, what about those? The default mode attention control.
Right. So the default mode network's connectivity peaked a bit later, around 16 months, and then plateaued. The ventral attention network showed a rapid increase in connectivity until about 21 months, and then remained relatively steady.
Okay.
The dorsal attention network followed a more gradual trajectory, starting its increase around 18 months. And perhaps not surprisingly, the control network, the one involved in those executive functions.
The CEO network.
Yeah, that one showed a steady increase in strength throughout the entire 6-year period they studied. It just kept getting stronger.
Which makes sense as kids get better at planning and self-control over those years.
Absolutely. And finally, the subcortical network maintained a consistently high level of connectivity throughout this whole early developmental window. It was just strong and stable from the get-go, highlighting its fundamental and ongoing role.
So it's clearly not just about these individual brain networks developing on their own schedule, is it? The study also looked at how these different networks interact with each other over time.
Precisely. That's a really crucial part of the picture. They examined the connections between these networks and observed how these inter-network relationships change. They looked for instances of integration.
Meaning they work together more.
Exactly, where networks showed increased positive connectivity, suggesting they're coordinating more closely. They also looked for competition.
Working against each other. Or maybe taking turns.
More like when one network becomes more active, the other becomes less so, indicated by negative connectivity, suggesting they might compete for resources or perform opposing functions. And they also looked for dissociation, where there was just no significant communication between specific networks.
So integration, competition, dissociation. This dynamic interplay between brain systems is really key to understanding how a mature brain organizes itself, I guess.
That's the idea. It's not static. These relationships evolve.
Can you give us some specific examples of how these interactions change during those first 6 years?
Certainly, they observed increase in integration between the default mode, control, and attention networks over time.
Okay, those higher-level networks start linking up more.
Yeah, which likely reflects the development of more sophisticated cognitive abilities that require these networks to coordinate their activity, like focusing attention while planning something, perhaps.
Makes sense. What about competition?
They also saw competition emerging, particularly between the more basic sensory networks like the visual and somatomotor networks and the higher order or emotion processing networks, often involving that default mode network.
So like when you're focused on seeing something, your mind-wandering network quiets down.
Kind of like that, yeah. These networks seem to compete for brain resources. Interestingly, they noted that the kind of adult-like competition we see between the ventral attention network reacting to things and the default mode network, internal thought, wasn't really established until around the age of 2.
So that ability to switch cleanly between external focus and internal thought develops around then.
That seems to be what the brain network data suggests, yeah. They also noted other developmental transitions like the limbic network, emotions, and the control network becoming more integrated during the first 2 years.
Linking emotion and control. Maybe reflecting the start of emotion regulation.
That's a very plausible interpretation, yes. Developing the ability to manage those feelings. And in some cases, they observed dissociation or a lack of significant communication, particularly involving the visual and attention networks in the youngest children. The researchers speculate this might be related to the fact that these infants were often scanned while asleep, when those systems might not be interacting as much.
Right, the sleep factor again. This paints such a vivid picture of how the brain becomes organized, like a complex dance between networks. But did these patterns, these growth charts, actually connect to the children's real-world cognitive abilities?
This is a really critical finding of the study, probably the most significant in terms of potential application. The researchers discovered that when individual children showed deviations from these typical developmental trajectories in their brain network connectivity.
Meaning their brain chart looked different from the average.
Exactly. Those deviations were significantly associated with their performance on a set of cognitive assessments called the Mullen Scales of Early Learning.
Okay, so the brain patterns predicted cognitive scores.
Yes. Essentially, what this means, or what it could mean for you, is that these brain growth charts might one day help us identify early on if a child's brain communication patterns are developing differently, potentially even before we see clear signs in their behavior or learning.
Wow, that could be huge for early intervention. Which specific cognitive areas were they able to predict based on these brain connectivity patterns?
They found that the patterns of brain connectivity could predict scores in areas such as expressive and receptive language. That's basically how children communicate and understand language, as well as their fine motor skills like manipulating small objects, and visual reception, which is how they process visual information.
And which networks were most important for those predictions?
It seemed to be a combination. The primary sensory networks, along with the control, attention, and default mode networks, all appeared to be particularly important. And they also really emphasized the importance of the connections between these different networks, not just within them.
So the interactions matter a lot.
They really do. Interestingly, while their overall model didn't significantly predict gross motor skills like running or jumping, they did find one specific connection between the somatomotor and control networks that was significant in predicting those skills. So it's complex.
Fascinating. So based on all these findings, what are the major implications? What's the big takeaway from being able to map these functional brain growth trajectories?
Well, I think one of the most exciting potential implications is definitely for the early identification of children who may be developing differently, atypically.
Right, the point you just made.
Yeah.
Right.
By having these typical developmental curves for brain function, we could potentially identify when a child's brain network development is veering away from the norm, perhaps much earlier than we can now.
And that could lead to earlier help.
Exactly. This could pave the way for earlier interventions, which we know can be incredibly effective in improving outcomes for many developmental conditions. It's like catching a potential issue early, similar to how we monitor physical growth, but for brain function.
That's a powerful analogy. What else?
Well, the study also just enhances our fundamental understanding of the typical timing of when different functional brain systems mature and become specialized. This could help us link specific brain changes to the emergence of different cognitive abilities we see in kids.
Like you mentioned with the visual network peak and recognizing faces.
Precisely. That early peak might be linked to that rapid visual development in infancy. And finally, it really highlights that brain development isn't just about individual brain regions maturing in isolation. It's very much about how these different networks learn to work together or compete or dissociate, and how they adjust their relationships over time. That dynamic interplay is key.
It's a system developing, not just parts. Okay, but of course, with any research study, especially one this complex, it's important to consider its limitations. What did the researchers themselves point out as potential limitations of their work?
Yeah, they were quite upfront about a couple of key areas. One, as we discussed, is that for the youngest infants in the study, a significant portion of the brain charts is based on scans taken while they were asleep, along with those statistical predictions of what their awake brain activity might look like.
So it's partly estimated for the very young one's awake state.
Correct. They stressed the need for more high-quality imaging data from infants while they are actually awake to further validate and refine these initial charts. Getting good awake data from babies is tough, but important.
I bet. Any other limitations?
They also mentioned that the statistical methods they use to harmonize the data from sleep and awake scans and across the different sites, those clever methods like ElasticNet and Combat.
Right.
While essential for their analysis, they might have slightly reduced the natural variability that exists in real-world brain activity. It's sort of a trade-off.
So in making the data comparable, some of the individual uniqueness might get smoothed out a tiny bit.
Potentially, yes. It's a balancing act between standardizing the data for comparison and capturing the full spectrum of individual differences in brain development.
Understood. So considering all of their findings, the methods, the limitations, what were the researchers' main conclusions and interpretations of what this all means?
They offered several important insights in their discussion. They proposed that the general early increase in connectivity observed in most of the brain networks, except for maybe dorsal attention, somatomotor, and subcortical, likely reflects the initial emergence and development of specific cognitive functions associated with those networks.
The networks ramp up as the skills come online.
That seems to be the idea. They also suggested that the decline in connectivity within the visual network after its early peak could indeed signify a process of functional specialization, like the network is getting more efficient, pruning connections, perhaps?
Refining its job.
Right. And the consistently high connectivity of the subcortical network, they believe, really emphasizes its fundamental role in supporting basic bodily functions and even early cognitive processes right from birth. It's foundational.
Okay. What about the network interactions?
They emphasize that the different patterns of integration and competition they saw between networks clearly illustrate how the brain becomes more efficiently organized as we develop. It's actively structuring itself.
Learning how to coordinate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For instance, that emergence of competition between the attention networks and the default mode network, they feel, supports the idea that infants are developing the crucial ability to shift between focusing on the external world and their own internal thoughts.
That back and forth switch.
Yeah. And the increasing integration of the limbic and control networks, as we touched on, likely reflects the development of our capacity for emotional regulation, learning to manage feelings.
That link seems really important.
It does. And finally, the strong link they found between deviations from these typical brain growth charts and performance on cognitive assessments provides, they argue, compelling evidence that the way our brain networks mature actually underlies the individual differences we see in how children learn and develop cognitively.
So brain maturation really does track with cognitive ability differences.
That's what the data strongly suggests, yes.
These functional brain growth charts, they sound like they could be an incredibly valuable tool in the future. It really makes you think about how they might actually be used in practice someday.
Absolutely. You start to wonder, right? Consider the potential for these charts to be used in pediatric healthcare, maybe in a way that complements the physical growth charts we already rely on.
Like a standard checkup could one day include looking at a brain function chart.
It's conceivable down the line. And then you have to ask, how might this knowledge shape our understanding and support of early childhood development, both, at home for parents and in educational settings? What are the ethical thoughts around that, too?
Those are really important questions to consider as this science progresses. If anyone listening wants to explore this research further, where could they find more information?
Well, they can certainly look for future studies from this research group at UNC and others who will undoubtedly build upon this foundational work. I'd recommend keeping an eye out for research that specifically focuses on obtaining more of that tricky awake state brain imaging data from infants.
To firm up those early charts.
Exactly, or studies that investigate the specific connections between these functional brain changes and various developmental outcomes or conditions. And if you really want to dive into the source, the Digital Object Identifier, or DOI, for the original article in Nature Human Behavior is 10.1038 S41562 025 021602.
Great, thanks for that. It's truly remarkable, isn't it, to think that we're now beginning to map these intricate brain network trajectories in early childhood. It makes you wonder, if these pathways are now being mapped, what other secrets of early brain development are just waiting to be uncovered?
Indeed, it feels like we're just scratching the surface.
Well, that brings us to the end of this deep dive into the fascinating world of early brain development and these new functional growth charts. Thank you so much for joining us and walking us through this important new research.
My pleasure. It was great to discuss it.
We hope this has given you, our listeners, a deeper appreciation for the incredible changes our brains undergo in those crucial early years. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into some compelling sources. Remember, in a world overflowing with information, understanding the underlying science is key.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.